Hi everyone, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal, Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, coming to you from Colombo, and my guest today is the Assamese writer, translator, and poet, Aruni Kashyap, joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to talk about his new collection of short stories, The Way You Want to Be Loved. Before we dive in, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patreon program on our website, where you can pay just $5 a month to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. The Way You Want to Be Loved tells the stories of queer and displaced lives from India's northeast. Across 13 stories, we are introduced to characters who are outsiders, immigrants, queer individuals in conservative societies, or minorities marginalized in Western and academic spaces, struggling to hold on to their identity while seeking connection and belonging. They wrestle with repression and the search for personhood in societies where identity is shaped and often compromised by forces larger than themselves. Kashyap's collection is also a powerful critique of the broken promises of democracy in both India and the United States. With unflinching honesty and moments of darkness, these stories navigate absurdity, grief, and resilience against a backdrop of different kinds of violence in Assam and beyond. Aruni, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your new book.
Shwetha, what a generous introduction, and thank you so much for including me in this podcast. I have been watching and listening to this podcast for a while now, so I feel very honored to be part of it.
The pleasure is ours, Aruni. Your collection takes us from villages in Assam to Delhi, the American Midwest, and beyond. And along the way, we meet characters who are all outsiders in different ways, grappling with identity, queerness, belonging, and violence. There's folklore and sorcery, but also deeply grounded stories about everyday lives. What really ties the stories together, I felt, is this sense of people pushing back against societal or cultural norms, government and institutional forces, or even internal struggles about who they are. So, to start us off, I'd love to hear about the writing process for this collection and how the stories first came together for you. Was there a common thematic or emotional thread that emerged early on, or did that become clearer later as the collection took shape?
That's a great question. I started writing these short stories in 2010, and I didn't think about a collection at that point of time. What I was just writing was things that are coming to me. I was also fresh out of college. In 2009, I had graduated from Delhi University, and I wanted to publish, and I wanted to see my work published. So novels are not published in magazines, so I thought I should start with short stories. So that is how I started writing the short stories. The earliest short story in the collection is actually His Father's Disease. And that is the story I use for my MFA applications to the United States as well. And it remains mostly unchanged. I grew up in Assam in the 80s and 90s. I was born in 1984. As a result of that, I think one of the most defining features of my life and my generation's life was probably the insurgency, the Alpha insurgency. But there were also many other different kinds of insurgent groups in Assam operating at that point of time. And this created a sense of normalized sense of fear, a normalized sense of insecurity, and that's how we grew up. And I think that is the reason why one of the common thread is the long shadow of the insurgency in these short stories. Even if they're in Minnesota or even other countries or Delhi, or much later, actually, after when the insurgency has supposedly waned, they still face the consequences of the insurgency. So I think the common thread here is the long shadow of the insurgency. And regarding the writing process, a lot of these stories came kind of, the characters are very interesting, so I liked going back to them, and they also helped me to understand many idiosyncratic situations. For example, the Hindjoti character. There are two short stories about the Hindjoti character, and I hope to write more. And he's someone very unique because he's in the United States for the first time. He comes from a lower middle class family, and he becomes the lens through which I look at the vagaries of the United States, the immigration story, which is basically American and Western propaganda that immigrants are going to be all wonderful here, which attracts immigrants, and actually they find out that the promise is much hollow. The social differences between Indians and Americans, or South Asians and Americans in general, the relationships, some of them flaky, but I think back in South Asia, we end up usually making very deep, meaningful relationships. When we ask, how are you? We really mean it, and if somebody gets sick, we don't send XO, we just actually go to their house and help them, or, really cook for them or take them out, to the doctor. We are not worried about germs being infecting on our, germs infecting us. We don't keep them at bay. So all of these things Himjoti finds very interesting. There are some other stories. For example, the Anil character appears in his father's disease and for the greater common good. So yes, the locales are very different because I have lived in these locations: rural Assam, urban Assam, Delhi, Midwest, and Georgia. So these are my places that I call home. A lot of these are obviously based on real life characters I met, but for dramatic effect, you give them a lot more trouble, a lot more drama, a lot more conflict. One thing I would like to mention is that my family actually comes from a family of what we call in Assam are Bej. They are basically healers, tantric healers actually. So we come from a place called Mayong, which has been a subject of a lot of curious explorers because it is a village of full of tantrics, and the stereotype is that it is a place where there is a lot of black magic. But that's not how it is. It's basically a community of healers who use different kind of indigenous modalities in order to approach healing of different kinds, from diseases to snake bites to entity removals. So my father's elder brother was actually one of those bears. For a lack of a better word, you can say healer or tantric. My grandmother was also a bear. She didn't do it professionally, but my father's elder brother did it professionally. So a lot of the experiences that actually Nirumoni goes through in for the greater common good is actually inspired by stories I have heard from my uncle.
It's fascinating to hear about all the different connections that we see in the stories themselves. And as you've just mentioned, you were born in the 1980s, at a time when the armed insurgency in Assam was at its peak. In another interview, you shared a personal story about how every day before you got on the school bus, your mother would take a long, intent look at you. And later in life, she told you that it was because there was so much violence at the time that she was preparing herself in case that was the last time she might see you. I think this is something that might be deeply familiar to people across South Asia who've grown up in areas with conflict. And for many in the Northeast in particular, the state has represented different forms of violence rooted in a long and complex political, ethnic, and even linguistic history. In your stories, and here I should also mention your previous collection, How to Tell the Story of an Insurgency, we see how life goes on in these contexts through family, love, desire, queerness, and even people's connection to the land around them. So, could you talk about translating these formative experiences into stories? Stories that engage with the collective memory of both past and ongoing forms of state repression and the violence in the Northeast.
Yeah, I mean, what a brilliant question. I actually, when I first started writing, a lot of my stories were full of anger. Because when I moved to Delhi in 2004, I realized that 6 people killed in rural Assam after a counter-insurgency operation is not the headline. It's the headline is that the price of onion has risen. So the government is worried that it might lose the votes. So what is important in mainland India and what is important news in marginal India was so vastly different. Electricity meters are reading the things incorrectly, and people are paying more prices. That is the national uproar, Or some politicians said something hateful, which is terrible. But at the same time, that's the front page news. But here we are dealing with deaths every day, not just one headline, many headlines. And some of them actually, if the number is not too large, say they are reduced to a small little column on the front page of the newspaper. So the impermanent state, that Sri Lanka also probably in the last, few decades faced, is very similar to what we face in Assam for a very long time. But also, I think India's Northeast has seen the worst side of the Indian state. So when people say things changed after 2014, I just think that things changed and got to worse after 2014. But actually, before that, in the northeastern states, Assam especially, has seen the worst side of the Indian state, the violence, the absolute brutality, with an absolute contempt at which people were treated, simply because they said we want equal rights. But I always like to remind people that in Northeast, many Northeastern states, and definitely in Assam, I'm terrible with dates. I'm not a historian, but I'll say since the 50s, we have had this rule called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which basically declares the area as a disturbed area and allows the government to shoot at sight, arrest without warrant, which totally takes away due process, totally takes away human rights. It has been condemned by numerous human rights organization, but it's still there. So what I'm trying to say is that in mainland India, you cannot shoot at sight. But in Assam, you can. In mainland India, you cannot arrest people without a warrant. But in Assam, you can. What does it really mean? It means that we grew up with unequal citizenship under the same constitution. So people were basically asking for their rights, self-determination, and all kinds of poison was injected, which led to the proliferation of insurgency movements and infighting, and that actually weakened many of these demands. So in a way, that's a complex history of how, with different means, the insurgencies, the rebellions, whatever you call them, were quelled. But when I started writing as a young person in Delhi University trying to get published, a lot of my stories were because of that anger, and I had distance, and I started reading more intellectually about Northeast. Initially it was, this is my life. I want to go and study in Delhi. But when I realized that, okay, there's a stark difference, and I relate more with the Sri Lankans, more with the Kashmiris in terms of my childhood. And I realized that, okay, there is something different here, and it was full of anger. And I learned how not to be angry, but actually focus on how people are relentless consumers of human life despite the violence in my first novel, The House with a Thousand Stories. And I wrote the first draft of House with a Thousand Stories. I kept it aside. 2 months later, I realized that this is a story that is almost sounding like an angry person writing. There is no delight in it. There's only disappointment. And then I read something by Toni Morrison. She said, I write from a space of delight, not disappointment. And by this, then you have been exposed enough to African American literature. And I thought, well, if a Black woman in America is ready to think only from a space of delight and keep aside disappointment to create art, I should try to do that as well. And that is when actually I started rewriting my first novel, and which became a lesson for me for the later stories as well, that I need to focus, I need to foreground the lives of the people, the perennial resistance of the people, the how they actually struggle every day. How do people even now live day to day instead of week to week, month to month? And I think that's the beauty, the grandeur of life, I think, is that attempt to live fully, even within the most horrific of circumstances. And when I look at people in these situations, I see that. And because of course, I know the people of Assam very well, I see that again and again. And I wanted to focus that. And the more you think, I also started thinking more in terms of characters and stories. And I realized that the insurgency is simply a backdrop. It does comment on state violence, human rights, and so on, and other things. But the things that the academic and the intellectual Professor Aruni is interested in is not interested for the storyteller Aruni. The storyteller Ernie will not be finding it useful. So I learned how to separate that by writing my first novel. So that was a big lesson for me. And hence, I think the plot or the story takes precedence over everything else, the characters, and everything else is a backdrop that is constantly impinging on the foreground, but it is not the primary story. And finally, I think it is also about establishing a sovereign imagination. Why should I let the state and any other horrific forces that are suppressing, brutalizing the society take center stage in my art? My art should be focusing on their people, their lives, their daily lives, even if it is mundane and quotidian. I don't want to give the state that much space. It already assumes too much space.
And it's a kind of burden of expectation, right? There's almost a fetishization when it comes to writing about conflict or violence, especially when you're an author from a region like the Northeast, Kashmir, Sri Lanka, or Myanmar. There's often this assumption that writers can't or shouldn't keep the experiences of conflict out of their creative expression. And you explore this tension so powerfully in the opening story, Skylark Girl, where at a literary conference in Delhi, an Assamese writer is challenged on why he hides behind magical folk tales instead of writing about insurgency, violence, and human rights abuses. And his response is that no one in Assam would ever ask that question because people there are reading about shootings, rape, dismembered bodies every day in the papers. So they wouldn't mind reading a story that allows them to escape. And then he adds, if I may quote, when we write about violence, we are asked to be quiet and discreet. Write about violence, but don't name anyone. The non-threatening Northeasterner who writes about real and topical issues, it is what everyone wants. End quote. Can you talk more about this? The pressures writers face to perform their trauma or to meet an outsider's idea of what their stories should be about?
Thank you. That's a great reading of the story. When I wrote Skylar Girl, I was simply interested in retelling this folk tale. I was inspired by quite a few other writers who have done this metafictional thing. Ambai is one of them. Nadine Gordimer is one of them. Adichie has done this as well. And then another Assamese writer called Orba Potonge Kolita has done it these are all short stories I'm referring to. So anyway, so these writers have actually explored through the medium of fiction something more sociological, more political, by kind of using this sandwich technique where there's a story unfolding, but they have gone to a conference, and or they have gone to a library to actually see what is happening, or a writing workshop, and so on and so forth, or a political meeting. But other things are also happening as it is, as the story is unfolding. So I thought this is a great, and I didn't think very highly of it, but Skylar Girl seems to have gone really far and wide, flew really far and wide, and fascinated people. People have written papers, and academic papers have been written. It is included in textbooks and anthologies again and again. So I'm really heartened to see the beautiful response for Skylar Girl, that it has generated so much conversation and thought. But a lot of the experience that Sanjay goes through actually is something that I face again and again. People would ask me, editors would ask me, can you give us a short story from set in Assam? Most of the time they would even say Northeast. Now they don't say it, but 10 years ago they used to. And then I would give them a story, and they would say, okay, we really want a real Northeastern story about the real problems. I'm like, yeah, somebody not going out and not getting milk for the kid is a real problem, because, and that he's not getting milk simply because there is a Assam Bandh, the shutdown that happens all the time, and that's why the kid is going hungry. But they're more interested in the Assam Bandh than the consequences of the Assam Bandh. But that's, you're actually looking for, which means that they're not interested in the stories of the people, but through the stories of the people, they're interested in the politics. I think that's a very insulting thing, right? Because fiction is not a space to do that. So that is one thing. The other thing is also some of the criticisms actually people from marginalized cultures face is something that I wanted to touch upon, not just as a writer from Assam or Northeast or India, but also as a writer from in the US. I'm a writer from from South Asia. So they expect this, Bollywoodish story, Bollywood biryani sari mango novel story. And when you don't write it, it is met with resistance, which is rejection and not getting published enough. So that's another problem. So what I want to sort of through the character of Sanjeev, I wanted to explore these tensions, and many of these, of course, is based on my own experience of going to conferences and people expecting me to write something else. When I would read something else, I think these expectations come from this fact that so little stories from marginalized regions or under discussed regions are finding space in the so-called wider space or the mainstream, for the lack of a better word. So that is one thing. So there is so little space for stories from under discussed regions that the one story has to be the all story, or the one story becomes the only story, or the one story is expected to represent everything. But the problem is that this so-called mainstream is so limited, it's so selfish, it gives us only one story, or the only one storyteller, only one artist. So I think mainstream has to open up in order to get diversity of stories. They are impoverishing themselves by not actually deliberately going forward and trying to give space to different kinds of stories from the marginalized section. These are some of the questions that I wanted to really explore actually in Skylar Girl, but I'm really glad that it has reached a wide range of readers who are responding to it in very interesting ways. And I want to say that there is no proper Northeastern story, there is no proper Indian stories, there is no proper Colombian stories, because human life is so diverse and so spectacular and so surprising that there cannot be a certain kind of story from one community, or it's humanity, and that's what makes it fascinating actually.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening, let's keep this conversation going. Please share your thoughts on the episode or on Aruni's books. If something resonated with you or even challenged you, leave us a comment on YouTube or send me an email. You'll find it in the episode description below to share your thoughts. We promise to read and reply to all of them. So, Aruni, this is something I've talked about before on the podcast, but I always love hearing different authors' takes on it. There's an essay by the novelist Sanjana Satyan in The Drift, where she critically examines how Jhumpa Lahiri, writing in the 2000s, became something of a blueprint for the South Asian immigrant novel. She was one of the first to depict the Indian American experience through the lens of realism, and that shaped how so many writers who came after her felt they needed to tell their own stories about the diaspora. But your book, in many ways, the stories push back against that. It captures the experience of being a minority within a minority. In a few of the stories, we find Assamese characters who have moved away from home to America. And once there, like so many others, they feel homesick, disoriented, but also find strange comfort in exile. And there's this tension, particularly in stories like Minnesota Nice and The Americans, between trying to hold on to themselves and the pressure to assimilate. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you approached writing the Assamese American immigrant experience, and how in doing that you were responding to or resisting the traditions of earlier diasporic literature.
That really sort of hits really well in what I was trying to do. So thank you so much for this deep understanding of my stories. Um, when I was growing up, just like Sanjana's essay and Sanjana's experience, the gold standard was Jhumpa Lahiri, right? Because she was so successful and she's a incredibly fine writer with amazing storytelling skills. And I remember getting actually in Delhi University, I think Ritika would agree if she's listening here, our producer. We used to have something called the paper presentation competitions, and which basically where you go to different colleges and they have this literary fest like organized by the English departments where we present a paper like a seminar paper, And I won a third prize once in Interpreter College. As a prize, I got Interpreter of Maladies to read. And that was my first actually Jhumpa Lahiri book that I read I was in first year or second year BA. So of course she became the gold standard. And I have to say, I had a complicated relationship with Jhumpa Lahiri's work. Initially, I didn't really sort of connect to her work, and I didn't understand what's the hoopla about. Partly because I read in three languages: Assamese, Bengali, and Hindi. So grew up reading a lot of Bangla stories where diasporic writing in Bengali was written already. I also read one of my most favorite writers is actually Ashapurna Devi. So Lahiri's work actually reminded me a lot about Ashapurna Devi. Basically there's a lot of similarities. When I thought that Ashapurna Devi is so much more powerful, that's what I thought. But when I thought that, okay, if I can read Ashapurna Devi, why would I read Jhumpa Lahiri? Because as an undergraduate young person, I constantly compared those two writers because, well, I don't know why, because I think there were some similarities there that to explore. Later, I found out that Jhumpa Lahiri did write an introduction to talking about her admiration for Ashapurna. So there's definitely some kind of literary intertextuality happening, definitely, that needs to be dived deeper into. But when I came to Minnesota, I started looking at Lahiri's work in a very new light. I connected with her work. I thought that she was talking about, even though she was talking about Bengalis in Boston or East Coast, I connected with her work. And I have taught her work multiple times, assigned her in my syllabi. But at the same time, one of the basic things as a young person, I was like, I want to see people like me in literature. Where are the people from Northeast? Where are the people from Assam in Asian American writing? So that was the one of the earliest, very basic desire to kind of write. So I thought that, well, there's this brilliant writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, Akhil Sharma, or even queer writers like Rakesh Satyal, who I read and admired so much. During that time, Rahul Mehta's book Quarantine had come out. So it kind of really meant a lot to me to see myself in all of these writers, immigrant, queer writers who are talking about an experience that I could relate to about South Asian people. And this was not the usual, I would say, the Sari Mango novels. And that really was refreshing to me. But at the same time, I wanted to see myself. And I know that was a very basic thing. Like at that point in time, it's not important to see myself that in that way, but then I wanted to write myself into the canon in some ways. So I started writing, and I thought that my work would expand the work done by these incredible diasporic writers. That is one thing I thought about. The other thing is that I thought about was how do I complicate the Indian American experience? Because I think when we bring in the experience of a brutalized region like Northeast, Assam, Nagaland, Tripura, or any other region where the state violence have been so brutal, and when you bring that into the diasporic writing experience, literature, it really complicates what has been thought about India, read about India. Anything from Northeast India, anything from Assam, any literature from Assam actually challenges what people understand as Indian literature, what people understand as South Asian literature, because people have seen India as a biggest democracy, but they have not seen India as an entity, as a force that has brutalized its own people. To quote Arundhati Roy, wage war against its own people, right? And when we bring in that experience and mix it to the diasporic literature with characters who are actually facing the long shadow of the insurgency, the long consequences of insurgency, it is bound to create complications, complicate the idea of India. So that was more artistically and intellectually much more appealing to me as I started writing and grew out of my very basic desire of, I want to see myself, which is a very, I think, natural desire, but I thought it was also a certain kind of immature desire. But for me, it was important to complicate the shades of India, challenge the global perception of India through my literary works, because most other writers writing in Assamese have already done that. So simply because I'm writing in English and I'm not worried about getting translated, and the fact that I am able to move spaces much more easily due to the job I do, I knew that the effect would be quicker. I know that the privileges of the English language. So that's what I wanted to do actually by writing these stories. And I thought that it would be a very interesting extension to Indian English writing. But at the same time, be sovereign, autonomous in its own way, because what we write in Assam is very different from mainland Indian literature. And I think that's what I wanted to establish. There was a conference where I talked about how actually the writings from Assam or Northeast is actually the result of the failure of Indian English literature. And I would like to elaborate that if I have the time. When I first started reading Indian English literature, I really enjoyed them. As I said, I think these are all amazing writers. But at the same time, I also felt that most of the diasporic Indian writing, not all of them, I would like to exclude writers like Amitav Ghosh or Aruni Roy. Aruni Roy is not diasporic, but I'm saying in general, the globally known Indian English writer, I think there was a I didn't think that those stories were written for me. It was written for somebody who is sitting in New York or Minnesota or Los Angeles, for whom actually little explanations are done, small paragraphs are added in order to explain Indian realities in a simple way. That was one of the things. The other thing was also the narrator was addressing not an Indian reader at all. It was addressing an editor sitting in New York or London. What do I mean by this? I don't want to say that, oh, they're trying to sell their works for bigger checkbooks. I think that's a very lazy argument to say. What I want to say is that there's a white gaze that actually Indian English writing suffers from. And I think that writers from marginalized regions in India, such as Dalit writers or writers from Northeast India, don't suffer from that, because we are not writing with the anxiety of being Indian. The whole experience of coming from Assam has been to assert the non-Indianness. It is seen in the literature, it is seen in the insurgency movements, by which I don't mean to say that I'm not proud to be. I'm definitely very proud to be from where I am. But I want to say that there has been that Indianness, because of the brutalities of the state, has been relentlessly questioned since the 1950s and 60s, and much more in the 80s and 90s. So how does it reflect in literature? And that reflection I wanted to bring. And I think that because in the subconscious or unconscious desire of Assamese writers to do that, as a result of that, we have produced a kind of writing that actually doesn't suffer from the white gaze. It doesn't suffer from the so-called Western gaze that dictates how the text is going to be shaped. And the biggest thing is that most diasporic writers, they actually are ridden with the anxiety of Indianness. How can they prove that they're Indian? How can they assert that they're Indian? But Assamese writers are not ridden by that anxiety, because the whole idea was to be sovereign. So that, and as a result, because political sovereignty was not possible, people chose imaginative sovereignty. And as a result of that, this thing of Indianness, the anxiety of being Indianness, what actually Meenakshi Mukherjee, the scholar, says the anxiety of Indianness, is not seen in the most writers from Northeast. So I say that where Indian English literature fails, literature from Northeast India begins. And it is true even politically. Here I want to bring in the Skylar Girl reference once again. I forgot to talk about Skylar Girl. Actually, the most obvious reading for an Assamese reader is actually reading of state violence. It's simply that because the stepmother who tortures the stepdaughter is not my metaphor, by the way, but this is the metaphor of everyone who has been part of the insurgency movements. The ALFA, the United Liberation Front of Assam, they repeatedly talked about the stepmotherly treatment of the Indian government. And they treat us, the stepmotherly treatment. As a result of that, we are rebelling. They're not rebelling for the sake of rebellion. They're rebelling because they've been treated badly, just like the Skylar Girl stepmother treats Tejimola badly. So Tejimola, for people of Assam, readers of Assam, is a very popular folktale, which is in Skylar Girl. But also, it is also a way to read the state and Assam relationships, actually. And much before I was born, the story was seen as a way to understand this relationship. And headlines every day when I was growing up, the center's stepmotherly treatment, people writing and critiquing central government policies, stepmotherly treatment, flood relief not provided, stepmotherly treatment, so that Assamese people see themselves in victimized, brutalized, mutilated, dismembered Tejimola. But at the same time, the Assamese people see themselves in the Tejimola who repeatedly refuses to give up on life. You cut her, throw her, she takes another form, grows, and becomes a bountiful plant, and again comes back to haunt you. So this resistance, this resilience, this refusal to give up on living is what most exciting and the most artistically challenging and stimulating to write about. And I think that's why I write about that. And I thought if I could bring this out and complicate the diasporic experience, it would definitely enhance and expand how we see South Asian literature.
That's absolutely brilliant stuff, Aruni. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm glad you also touched on the desire to see reflections of yourself in the literature that you read. So, queer, gay, transgender communities across India have expressed the burden of living in a country that has for so long criminalized their existence, whether it's being shunned by family, facing social isolation, lacking protections at work or in schools, or being vulnerable to police abuse and sexual violence with almost no legal recourse. Experiences that are reflected in your stories in the collection. Your title story, The Way You Want to Be Loved, also stands out as a moving queer love story that offers a rare glimpse into intimacy and resistance. It's particularly powerful in a country where same-sex relationships were illegal until as recently as 2018, when the Supreme Court finally struck down Section 377. You've also previously mentioned that the story was inspired by a true story, one that you wanted to give a different ending to. Could you talk about what drew you to that story and how you chose to reimagine it? And how important was it for you to center queer lives and relationships in these stories, especially in a context where they continue to live under the weight of repression and invisibility?
When the judgment came, obviously we were all so happy. It was very emotional moment for everyone I know, my friends, all of us. I was actually in Athens, Georgia. I think it was September. One of my dear friends called me and he was just overwhelmed with joy and weeping. He said, I never thought this would happen in our lifetime. And I know that is a response of almost everyone I know who cares about. Um, so it was a big moment. But from the next hour, I think, because we are thinkers, we started thinking, courtroom to bedroom to courtyard, how long it is going to take, because the fight is still not over. We need legal protections, right? More legal protections of marriage and so on and so forth. So I think and also mentality has not changed. So we were thinking about that, and I remember talking about this to a lot of her friends. So yes, the legal fight is over, but there's a long way to go as well, and we have to keep on centering queer stories in order to public opinion to change, actually. And I think popular media has, despite the problems, we should definitely critique them. But I think in recent years there has been a lot more queer stories that are foregrounded in popular OTT media, and that is, I think, they really challenge received notions. I've seen people accepting their children, actually, because, I saw that Madhuri Dixit movie where she's comes out as lesbian to her kids. I saw that show on Netflix where the parents rejected, and tragic things happen. So we don't want our kids. These are our kids. So I have seen the narrative changing among people who would even not even talk about it, not even utter the word homosexuality or queerness or lesbian. They just wouldn't even acknowledge that such a thing existed. But now they're watching, it's on your face. So I think those are some hopeful things, and we need to continue doing that in literature. And The Way You Want to Be Loved, yes, I heard a story where the story had a tragic consequence. And it just didn't leave me that somebody was arrested while their one of the parents was in the hospital, and they couldn't meet them at the last moment. I mean, it was so difficult for me to digest, and that's why I started writing. And that's why it is one of the longest stories, almost like a novella. I could have gone for another 5,000 words. I knew how to stop, but I thought that I really need to tell myself a different ending in order to get out of this sadness. I was very sad when I heard, but then I realized that I had actually heard many, many of those stories, people being arrested for just simply sitting. Many of my queer activist friends would tell tell me that that story of being harassed, arrested, and I wrote the story before the judgment actually, is very common story. So and it always had a tragic ending. Somebody feisty would go and take them out, or either they would go through all kinds of problems, even torture or even harassment in the lockup until they are released, because you can't like hold them indefinitely. And it also depends so much on what class you belong to, how much money you have, do you have access to legal resource, legal recourse, and so on and so forth. So it is also about access. What about people who don't have access? So I wanted to give it a new ending, and I at least wanted the lovers to be together, because there's another queer story there, called His Father's Disease. The ending is very tragic. So I wanted to balance it out, that there are different possibilities in queer endings. Also, we see a lot actually of queer stories where the ending is very tragic. So it kind of keeps on telling. I think it keeps on telling us that, okay, this is how your life is going to be. I sometimes I like to joke that a lot of the famous queer novels actually has black and white covers. And I thought, why do you have black and white covers? The lives are much more colorful then, and but yeah, so it was my desire to rewrite the ending of these two lovers, give it a new ending, in order to just for myself to feel better in the first place, also to send a message. And I also wanted to write it in a second person, because I wanted to address the general readership. And I think addressing the reader directly like that creates a kind of tension between the reader and the writer, and through the addressal of the you, which creates a certain kind of discomfort. The discomfort is at the level of many things. First, that it is not a common first person I. Second, that it is not a third person omniscient writer. So you are thrown a little bit away because you encounter you. It's like somebody's sending you a letter where you are constantly implicated. You are told, it's much more intimate, and it creates discomfort because you're not used to reading you stories that are second person. But I wanted to make the people feel uncomfortable a little bit. If the people in the story can go through so much tragedy and still survive, you can feel the discomfort of reading in second person a little bit, and that would probably hopefully make you more alert to the pain of these characters. So it was basically a aesthetic choice for me to do that, artistic and aesthetic choice to write this story with that ending and in that style, and also a very long story, so for which I apologize.
No, don't apologize. I would have happily read a full-length novel based on that story because it was so beautifully written. And Aruni, in Indian literature, queer characters, like you mentioned, are often confined to the margins. They are given tragic endings or appear only in supporting roles. And for a long time, stories by queer writers have been a quiet presence, almost entirely self-published or by small presses, and even shelved separately from other genres, right? And that's beginning to shift now, with more queer narratives being brought out by the mainstream publishers. But even today, stories of queer characters and stories written by queer writers from regions like the Northeast are few and far between. And your book is an important new contribution in changing that. So, what has it meant for you as a queer writer from the Northeast to bring these characters and stories to life? And how do you see the way you want to be loved pushing these boundaries and opening up the space for more of these stories to come?
I don't really see myself as someone who is opening up space, but thank you for saying that. And if it is opening up, I'm delighted, but I really don't want the credit for it. But I do think that either whatever the theme is, I think I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and that gives me the whatever little visibility that I get. And the giants, by which I mean, is that I have inherited a literary tradition that is 1,000 years older than Indian English writing. Assamese is a classical language, goes back to the 5th century. We have a consistent writing tradition. I grew up reading in Assamese. I grew up reading in Bengali. I grew up reading in Hindi and English, of course. But this has meant is that I've been able to inherit a very, very long tradition where the novel is fully formed. The short stories have been experimented enough that I have very little to do in terms of form and craft into experiment. Assamese short stories are very adventurous, not just thematically, but also formally inventive. There's a queer tradition in Assamese writing. I think it's problematic because most of the time the queer characters come out as these violent, deviant characters. This is mainly because a lot of cis women have written about queer characters, and so far mostly, and then men have written about queer characters who live heterosexual lives, at least. I don't know, I can't assume what their sexuality is, but either way, the representation has been mostly very problematic. It is shown as this deviant desire. It is shown as this wrong thing that people are doing, but also it shows the curiosities of these writers to be able to explore that. They don't understand queerness as such. There are discussions about that in Assamese literature where writers have kind of tried to grapple with. But I think in modern times, a lot of new young writers have written short stories, not novels as I know of, but definitely quite a few short stories on queer relationships, on found families, alternative relationships, and so on and so forth. And I think these writers are also learning a lot by reading online different kind of writing that is published across the world, translated across the world. Literature from other languages that have been translated is accessible now in India, and that has really sort of opened up the discourse in a much enabling way. And I think the new generation of writers are going to change the conversation about queer writing from Assam. It is small in number, but I think they are making a significant impact because they are able to gain space in the mainstream discussion in a variety of ways in Assamese language. But they have to be translated, and they have to be responsibly translated and responsibly published. So that is something that I hope that happens. I'm a translator, I can't translate everything. So I'm hoping people will translate it. I'm hoping good publishers will take it up, good agents will represent them.
In the story Before the Bullet, we meet a young man who's returned to Assam after studying in the US for 6 years, and he's shot by the army before he even reaches home. He didn't know the new and unspoken rules for staying safe around the army officers stationed there. And like this one, several stories in the collection give us a glimpse of state-sanctioned brutality and violence in the Northeast. You've previously spoken about having to tone down your writing because the Western publishing world often hesitates to carry stories like this that are considered too dark. But literature has the power to hold space for uncomfortable truths. In India today, fiction is often a bearer of truth and can publicly say what might otherwise be censored, to push back against the coerced silence that's a favored tool or favored weapon of those in power. A reviewer for the Open magazine, for instance, gives a fair warning for your stories. They write, "It's also dark AF, so carry a flashlight." Tell us about how you've navigated the challenges of writing and publishing these darker stories, especially in mainstream Western and Indian literary spaces that might not always be open to them.
Yeah, it's been difficult. And this is what I think a lot of Western publishers and literary agents have told me. His father disease went to many publishers, many agents. I do have a literary agent now, but I published His Father's Disease in the US on my own because I started approaching independent publishers. And thank God, Gaudy Boy, published by, which is an imprint of Singapore Unbound in New York, they took a chance on me and have been incredible in terms of their support. But I do think that in general, especially in America, it is funny because it's a space where grisly thrillers are selling in millions, but yet literary publishing or realist publishing or general fiction, as they call it here, they don't want things that are too sad, too dark, too dangerous, too uncomfortable. It's a space where dark academia is a big genre, but at the same time, they don't want dark realist fiction. This is too sad, too uncomfortable, too worrisome. I think that means that American publishing really sort of It's a commentary on American publishing, and I can go on and on about that. I think it means more responsible editors. I think it means I think it means also that the editors probably need to watch more global news and not CNN and not New York Times, but more other international outlets, and see what is happening in the world is far more horrible, far more reprehensible than what a few writers from marginal spaces are actually trying to depict in their fiction. So they would realize that what we are writing is far more state. My goal as a writer is to be truthful to my art. What do I mean by that? By which I mean is that even in the darkest of spaces, even in the darkest of moments, yes, which means I write dark stories, probably. What is not dark about a situation when there's a 36-hour, 72-hour Assam band where people who actually are daily wage earners totally go hungry, crazy, unable to feed their families, because if they go out and work, only then they can come back with money and feed their family for a day. We are dependent on our monthly paychecks. These people are dependent on their daily paycheck. And I've seen that happening in Assam in the 90s, early 2000, when such shutdowns were going on by one insurgent groups after another. August is almost gone because it's Independence Day. Most of the months in August, most of the days in August, we would have shutdowns and long, long shutdowns as protest against Independence Day, So, and then obviously there is insurgency, when you are surrounded by the army and villages are set on fire. What is not dark about them? That is definitely dark about them. As a writer, my job is to depict that darkness, but at the same time, also find what is hopeful, because that's what art is about. So find the delight even in the darkness, I think, is the motto. I don't know how I have resisted this. Actually, I actually continue to write the kind of stories that are important to me. I'm a tenured professor, so that probably helps me in many ways, because if a book doesn't find a publisher, it'll make me sad, but it doesn't bother me, because I'm not dependent on my writing. I'm not dependent on the earnings from my writing, if there are any earnings. The ability to be an academic, despite all the flaws in academia, the ability to be an academic gives me the freedom to support writers who I think are important, who are usually not supported by the mainstream, and I use my space to do that. I also think that because I have a stable job, if a book fails, it fails. I'll write another book. It doesn't bother me because I know how to write a book. I probably don't know how to navigate the vagaries of the publishing industry, but I know how to write a book, and I'll keep writing that book again and again until it finds home. And I think also because there are so few of us from Assam here, we don't have the option of giving up. So yes, it may be a problem, but I still continue to write the kind of work that I want to write. I think my next novel is pretty dark and very sad, but we are talking about sad realities. But we have to balance it also with, and because that's what life is. It's not only sad; it's also happiness. Despite the terrible things that are happening in war zones, people are still enjoying life. So my duty as an artist to depict that continually. But yes, my critique of the publishing industry being too careful, too circumspect, all of those are problems that the publishing industry will have to deal with eventually, because it will eventually come to haunt them. And it is happening already, and it's not my concern. And I don't like it, but I can't change it.
Aruni, I'm so happy to hear you have a forthcoming novel. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited too. I'm working on the edits right now.
Amazing. And Aruni, thank you for the wonderful conversation and for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure to have you on the SARB podcast.
My God, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sending you lots of warm wishes to Himal and you for doing this podcast. As I said, I listened to it. It's been it's been lovely to chat with you, and your questions are really great.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal, South Asian. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of South Asia podcast, hosted by Associate Editor Nayanthara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian literature like no other. And that gives us a very unique community viewpoint and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to help us out, please do become a paying Himal patron for just $5 a month. We have a great program with lots of perks, including Himal's iconic right side up map, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic Southasia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.